Hey everybody, this is Brent Scott and you're watching the Blitz C&E channel. So today's video is about a dyno test that I did, a comparison between the LS Cathedral Port versus the square port cylinder head LS type. So just give you a little bit of background on this test. I didn't originally mean to do this test in the beginning. What I had was in my dyno, I had purchased a Holley Dominator ECU, and what I want to do was get an LS engine on there so I could start getting used to it and dial it in. So I went out and picked up a older LQ4 6-liter LS truck motor. It came out of a 3/4 ton wreck truck. The thing was close to 200k miles on it, but I didn't really care because my ultimate goal was just to get myself familiar with the dyno and run LS fuel injection stuff on there. Well, it ended up working out pretty well in the end, so I ended up doing this comparison test, so I wanted to share the results with you. Now, when I did this test, and this goes into why I swapped the heads out, when I ran this engine on there, I kept on having problems with it. Right around 4,300 or so, the engine would break up. It'd act like a misfire, and I could not figure this out for my life. Because I thought it was a dyno, ignition system, did all this work. So long story short, it ended up being a bad fuel injector. But unfortunately, by the time I figured it out, I had already changed the heads on there and did all this work on there. So I wasn't able to repeat the tests with the stock engine configuration. But I will share it with you, just so if you're interested on there, the dyno results. So as is stock, now you can see in the dyno curve that there's definitely the dip around the 4,000, 4,300 mark. This engine, as is stock, with all the miles on there, made 371 horsepower and about 400 foot-pounds of torque. Honestly, I really don't think if I didn't have the issue with the fuel, I don't think it would make much more power. You'd be lucky with the engine the way it was. I wouldn't think it'd make more than 380, 385 horsepower, to be honest with you. Just based on all the averages and the dynos testing I've done, that would be my best guess. Now, to give you some background on the dyno, I do run a full exhaust system, all right? So it's got 3-inch exhaust and it's got mufflers on there. I have noise constraint issues, but actually this works out because I do 98% street strip stuff that would run a full exhaust system. So this is probably pretty accurate what this motor would do. One thing about dynos, everybody's numbers are going to be different because everybody's dynos set up differently, just like everybody's flow bench number is. So this engine might make more power or less power on another dyno, but these are my numbers, and this is what it makes right there. So let's move forward. Now, just to talk about this test between the two cylinder heads. So what I had done in the process of trying to troubleshoot, I actually had a good set of LS1 241 cylinder heads, Cathedral Port, and they had a light porting on there, but I knew they were good cylinder heads and had good springs, 600-inch beehive springs on there. And I ended up changing out the lifters, brand new, put in good push rods. I actually did a trunnion kit, and I actually put a Trailblazer SS intake on there, which actually probably could have got away with using the stock, or I had a ported one, but that's a different test and different conversation on it. I'm going to talk about that, kind of interesting. But I did put a cam in this for the test, very mild. Now this is a cam that you could run on the street with no converter on there. So it's just right on that edge, where the cam that I put on there had a 216 duration on the intake side at 50,000s and 220 duration on the exhaust at 50,000. It had a 114 LSA, which is really wide, and it only had 550 inches of lift. So it's just very mild performance cam for street. So here's the results for the dyno I'll put up here, but the only difference between I put LS3 heads on there, they were the 821 heads. Now they were all stock as is, and they flowed about 300 CFM the way that they were. And I did run the LS3 intake on there, not the truck intake. So there's a little bit of difference in there, but I don't think it really made a difference. Now, to put things in perspective, when I talk about the LS1 ported heads that I had, there was light porting. They flowed about 270 CFM at 550 inches lift. Now you may think, well, that's a big difference between the LS3 head. They generally flow 310 on average CFM, or maybe a little bit more depending on what flow bench you're testing on there. But to put it in perspective, if this engine was a 10.5 compression motor and you put the right cam in there in the combination, these heads could actually support 550 horsepower out of a 6-liter engine, which is way more than enough cylinder head for this test that I did and with this cam combination. And obviously the LS3 exceeds it in airflow. So let me show you the test results. And now here in the dyno results, as you can see, I thought this was pretty interesting. I thought for sure the LS3 cylinder head would definitely make more power up top. But as you can see, all the way through the curve, not just in horsepower, but from generally up to 3,500 and up, it made more horsepower and more torque. And the torque was maybe about, the torque, we made 426 foot-pounds of torque on the LS3 head and 412 foot-pounds on the LS1 cylinder head. So about, 15 roughly or so foot-pounds of torque. And then the horsepower is close to about 21 horsepower difference. Now, as you see that I'm still getting used to the tuning, the curve, they drop off pretty short, but honestly, if I was doing a better job or what I've learned now, it would have been a little bit straighter and maybe made a little bit more peak power, but I don't think more than 5 to 8 more horsepower I would have been able to tune on there. But it would have been relative. I definitely think the difference between the two would be about the same as far as a horsepower rating. I don't think there would be much advantage on there. But even if you come in there and you zoom in, I mean, even down below, which I thought this was weird. I really thought the Cathedral Port would do much better, even in the lower RPM scale. But even from 2,400 up to 3,100, the LS3 head, and I did several pulls with all these motors, probably about anywhere from 6 to 5 or so with the, when I finally got them tuned in, not to include a couple of warm-up pulls. But just on average, even down below, the LS3 had made just slightly more torque, but never once out of all the averages or the dyno, if you did the overlays, did you ever see the LS1 Cathedral Port cylinder head actually make more power down below. It was always either even or making less power, which I thought was interesting. Now, one thing you may not know, I know with dynos, water brake dynos, 99% of the guys you see watching dyno testing, they all run water brake dynos. They're not efficient to pull them underneath 2,000 RPM. Now, sometimes I pull it in at 1,500, but there's usually like a dip in the dyno curve, and then it slowly comes up, but they're just not designed for that. So if you guys are like thinking, well, what about at zero acceleration, the Cathedral Port does better. I don't know, and no one's going to ever be able to tell you with a water brake dyno, just the way that they're built. So that's a situation where, only the racetrack's going to truly tell you if you have some performance gains at much lower RPMs. But overall, I thought this was kind of an interesting test between the two. That it just generally made more power all the way through the curve, which was what really surprised me. And I've noticed as I've seen other guys doing tests between Cathedral Port and the square port cylinder heads, they had the same thing. And what's interesting, this is like a low horsepower, low cam combination, lower RPM, making more power. But you can even see here that the LS3 cylinder head makes excellent torque, which you wouldn't think so. The common misconception was always said that for street you want a smaller port. Well, that was true in the older generation motors. Like I had a 351 Cleveland. It was the 4-barrel heads, which were extremely large, and these things almost flowed 300 CFM, I think, out of the factory. Don't quote me on that. But the thing about this car, it had no bottom end. It was just horrible. And then until you got to about 3,500 and up to 6,000 RPM, it was great. But it was just a real dog. But just to give you an idea why the LS cylinder heads don't really suffer from this, even with larger ports, is that over the years they've gotten better at developing cylinder heads. But the one thing they do with the LS3 cylinder and LS7 cylinder head is they really perfected the short turn, and I've seen up to 420 feet per second of velocity through there. So what they do is they create a lot of depression in there. So at lower RPMs, when they're open the valve, you have a really fast air speed in there. So that's why you have good throttle response on a cylinder. Usually in a situation like with a large port and a large valve, you wouldn't have that. So they really learned to manipulate that well. That's why you don't see this problem in the LS cylinder heads but you would find in the older days of, small block Chevy and big block Ford or whatever. Too big of a port on the street. It was just too lethargic. Well, I hope you like the test, but I would like to hear people's comments, because ultimately this is done on the dyno, but the real test is at the racetrack. I would be curious if any of you guys have actually done a test to put the Cathedral Port cylinder head on there and a square port, and how does it do at the drag strip, because that's the ultimate test. But my impression is, though, if you're buying a 6-liter and you want to do some work to it later, or cam it and stuff like that, for the money, versus porting your Cathedral Port head, or just buying a refurbished LS3 head, which there's a ton of them out there, for the cost, it kind of seems like the LS3 head is the way to go, or at least that's the way I would go. And certainly if you were going to stroke the motor, it's kind of like a win-win situation. But anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.